How do you work out how to make a salt? So there are three methods that you can make salts, and the method that you select depends on if the products and reactants are soluble or if they're insoluble. So there are three different methods. The first method is if the reactants and products are soluble, there's one way of doing it. And an example of this is sodium chloride, which is prepared by reacting sodium hydroxide solution, soluble, and hydrochloric acid solution, soluble. The next example is if one of the reactants is insoluble and the product is soluble. For example, preparing copper sulfate. And we prepare copper sulfate by reacting insoluble copper oxide, one of the reactants is insoluble, sulfuric acid, which is soluble, but the product that you make is soluble. So copper sulfate is soluble. The last method you have to use is if both reactants are soluble and the product that you make is insoluble. For example, lead chloride is prepared by reacting lead nitrate and sodium chloride. Lead chloride is insoluble, the product is insoluble, and both reactants, lead nitrate and sodium chloride, are soluble. So the flow chart to help you work out which method to use is think, is it a sodium, a potassium, or an ammonium salt? If it is, then you have to use something called a titration. I'll explain what that means in a couple of slides' time. Is the salt soluble? If it is soluble, and if it isn't a sodium, potassium, or ammonium salt, you have to use the copper sulfate method. And last but not least, if the salt is insoluble, then you have to use the precipitation method. But here are the three methods: making a sodium, potassium, or ammonium salt, making a soluble salt that isn't a sodium, potassium, or ammonium salt, and making an insoluble. So the procedure for each of these is very common. It's the same for every type of method, but you have to change the reagents, the chemicals that you're going to use. So if we want to make, for example, NaNO3, sodium nitrate, then what we have to do is put 25 centimeters cubed of sodium hydroxide into a conical flask using a burette. Add an indicator, e.g. methyl orange, that will change colour. You add the nitric acid from a burette until the indicator changes colour. Record the volume of the nitric acid that you've added. Repeat using the same volume of alkaline acid, but without the indicator. Evaporate most of the water to make a saturated solution. Filter off the crystals and then leave the crystals to dry in a warm place. So we chose nitric acid H2O3 because we want to make sodium nitrate. If we wanted to make sodium chloride, we use HCl, hydrochloric acid. And if we want to make sodium sulfate, we use H2SO4 to make sodium sulfate. The second method is to make a soluble salt that isn't a sodium salt, a potassium salt, or an ammonium salt, for example, copper sulfate. So what we do for this method is we add 50 centimeters cubed of sulfuric acid into a beaker and we heat it to speed up the reaction. You add spatula of copper oxide and you stir, and you keep adding until no more copper oxide reacts, so you end up with black copper oxide at the bottom of the beaker. This means the copper oxide is in excess, and the solution will go blue because you've made copper sulfate solution. You filter off excess copper oxide, you heat the solution in an evaporating basin until some of the water has evaporated. You will allow the solution to cool. You collect the crystals that you've made by filtration and then leave the crystals to dry in a warm place. The last method, making insoluble salts, for example, lead iodide, PbI2, is you add 25 centimeters cubed of sodium iodide solution to 25 centimeters cubed of lead nitrate solution. Sodium iodide and lead nitrate are both soluble. You will then get a yellow precipitate of lead iodide made, which is a solid. You filter off the mixture to collect the lead iodide, and then wash the lead iodide with 20 centimeters cubed of distilled water to remove unreacted sodium iodide. You then put the filter paper with the lead iodide, which is a solid, in a warm place to dry. So here are the three different methods that you need to know how to prepare a salt. Making a sodium, potassium, or ammonium salt uses this method, which is a titration. Making a soluble salt that isn't sodium, potassium, or ammonium uses this method. And making an insoluble salt uses this method. So let's look at some examples. How could we prepare Na2SO4, sodium sulfate? Well, this is a sodium salt, and because the purple box here is making sodium salts, we're going to use this procedure over here. So this procedure here in the purple is making NaNO3 and uses nitric acid. We want to make Na2SO4, so rather than using nitric acid, we have to use sulfuric acid. The rest of the procedure is the same, but we're not going to use nitric acid, we're going to use sulfuric acid. Number 2, preparing lead chloride. Lead chloride is an insoluble salt, and because it's an insoluble salt, we won't use the procedure here in yellow. This particular procedure is going to make lead iodide, but we want to make lead chloride. So rather than adding NaI, to make our lead chloride, we're going to add NaCl. The rest of the method stays exactly the same. And last but not least, how to make copper nitrate CuNO3 twice. Well, copper sulfate is a soluble salt that isn't sodium, potassium, or ammonium, so we're going to use this method here. So this method on this side makes copper sulfate, and to make copper sulfate, it uses copper oxide and sulfuric acid. The question is asking us to make copper nitrate, so rather than adding sulfuric acid, we're going to use nitric acid, but the rest of the procedure stays exactly the same.